On most days, we go in-depth on a single story, but once in a month, we like to take a step back from our usual format and spend a bit of time gathering fresh insight and analysis from those covering world events. To help us dive into these issues, we've put together a distinguished panel of journalists. Joining us is Wang Guan. He's the chief political correspondent for CCTV America's Mandarin service. Simon Marks is the president and chief correspondent for Feature Story News, and Afshin Molavi is a non-resident fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the editor of the New Silk Road Monitor. Thanks, gentlemen, to all of you for joining us. Afshin, let's start with the Syria conflict. This tragedy never seems to have an end. It's a catastrophe, a country destroyed. There is a ceasefire in place, but it's barely hanging by a thread right now. And then we get news that there's been an airstrike on a hospital, a pediatric hospital of all things, 60 people killed, including children. Firstly, let me ask you, do we know who's responsible, and is the ceasefire does it mean anything right now?
I think you're right. I mean, we're witnessing a country destroyed, the death of a nation, really. 11 million Syrians have been made refugees, either external or internal, 400,000 dead. When it comes to this particular strike on this children's hospital, there has been a pattern, an unfortunate pattern of the Syrian regime and its Russian ally targeting hospitals, targeting aid workers, targeting water and electricity infrastructure. And the idea behind that targeting is to demoralize local populations, to encourage migration, to prepare the way for a ground invasion. It has become very clear Syria wants to retake Aleppo. And these kind of strikes, though we don't know where this strike came from, we will find out probably within the next few days. But there has been this pattern of striking. And so what we're likely seeing is part of this war strategy of retaking Aleppo by demoralizing local populations and hitting at civilians.
Simon, these are shocking attacks. They're war crimes, aren't they? And we look at some of the recent figures. 148 civilians have been killed in Aleppo in the past 6 days. Altogether, something like 400,000 people, civilians, since the start of the conflict. Now, we get the United States says it's sending in an additional 250 troops. To what end?
I mean, really, 250 people, as though that's going to turn the tide here. Look, I mean, we're speaking at the end of a week in which Donald Trump made his big foreign policy address here in Washington, D.C. I thought most of it was incoherent. But inasmuch as there was a coherent section, it was where he was talking about Syria and faulting the Obama administration and saying that President Obama's hesitation initially and then subsequently throughout his administration to take this problem seriously and to respond proportionately had fueled the growth of Islamic State and created the problem that now exists on the ground. You know, for the Syrian regime, it's very interesting. I used to travel to Damascus fairly regularly, and every time, before the war, and every time you'd sit down with Syrian government officials, and at the end of the interview, they'd say to you, have you ever been to Aleppo? You must go to Aleppo. It's the most beautiful city. You really have to go to Aleppo. Aleppo is hugely important for them. And now they find themselves engaged in this extraordinary, catastrophic, tragic, criminal, scorched earth policy to try and take back a city that matters to them, but if they ever succeed in taking it back, they will have destroyed it in the process. It's an absolute disaster.
And Simon, why is there this hesitancy on the part of the United States and its allies in Europe, of course, to get involved in Syria? I mean, they could always, at this point, invoke the doctrine they invoked in Libya.
There's two reasons. I mean, first of all, there's the Iraq experience. They don't want to go through the Iraq experience all over again. Their voting publics don't want to go through the Iraq experience all over again. And secondly, because in the case of President Obama, he's in the final year of office. It's all about legacy at this point. This is the president who was absolutely determined to leave office ending wars, not starting new ones. And he's looked at Syria, he's looked at the prospects for success there, and he said, I'm not touching it.
Guan, China has been playing an active role in this search for peace in Syria, and it's a little bit of a departure for China, isn't it? Because the Chinese have always engaged in what has been known as cautious diplomacy, involved in diplomacy where it affects China directly, but it's been at the peace talks, the two previous rounds of peace talks. How does China view this escalating situation in Syria?
Well, because radical Islam is a challenge that faces China as well, and as a growing military and economic power, China feels that partly due to the pressure from the international community that it has a stake in the Middle East, in its stability, that is demonstrated by its role in the P5+1 talks in Iran, its reconstruction of Afghanistan, where China is working very closely with the US. When it comes to Syria, China, yes, like you said, supported the UN brokered peace talks, special envoy visits, because, as you know, China is a permanent member of the Security Council. And on the other hand, seizing on what my colleague Simon just said, I think that the US need to demonstrate a stronger policy of deterrence. Because if you set a red line for President Assad in 2013 and then not follow through with the red line, and then if you said Assad must go and then fighting the same enemy Assad is fighting, this is ambiguity from the outsider's point of view that is not enough to deter the extremists. So you have to have a policy of deterrence, credible deterrence, so strong that the extremists dare not mess with it. But that's not the case. We see the beheadings, mass beheadings, where Chinese nationals were beheaded, and all the attacks in Western Europe.
Afshin, before we move on, one more question on the Syria conflict, and that is, as one points out, we need some strong deterrent actions by the United States, by its allies in Syria. Are we going to see that? This is an election year.
Yeah, it's unlikely that we're going to see that. I mean, President Obama, if you recall, he gave a prominent interview to the Atlantic magazine in which he declared that the moment that he decided not to strike at Syria, after Syria had passed the red line, he described that as one of the proudest moments of his presidency. He didn't describe it as a complex moment. I was full of torture. I was, internally agonized over this decision. He described it as one of the proudest moments of his presidency. This is a president, as my colleague noted, who does not want to get involved in, another Middle East war. But on the other hand, every step of the way, he keeps saying, well, if we enter, it's going to be a hornet's nest. Well, by not entering, that hornet's nest has multiplied 5 to 10 times over.
And by not entering, de facto, he's allowed the Russians to play a principal central role on the ground there. And while that may not be a huge problem rhetorically for Barack Obama over the course of the next few months, it's going to be a huge problem for Hillary Clinton over the next few months, the woman who presented the Russians herself with that big reset button when she was Secretary of State.
Okay, I want to move on to the next big development in the past few days, and that is climate change. We had that big agreement that was signed in New York, Guangguan. China has thrown its full support behind the Paris Agreement on climate change. Now, of course, comes the hard part, implementing that. Is China confident that it will be able to implement that and at the same time meet all those goals in there?
Yeah, and I think climate change is so vital to China. Air pollution is so bad in Beijing and major metropolises, so much so that according to a third-party consulting firm, 1.6 million people in China die from breathing toxic air. And air pollution has cost China 6.5% of its GDP in 2015. In other words, it could have grown 6.5% faster had it not been for the loss of productivity, the shutting down of factories due to toxic air. So now comes the hard part, that is implementation. Because we know that when policies from the central and the international level comes down to local levels, it did not get implemented. I think there are several challenges. First of all, China needs to keep its growth going. But right now, China faces excess capacity. In northern China alone, its excess capacity for steel is 3 times the amount of the annual EU production. So how can China resolve all these excess capacity while implementing its climate change goals? And secondly is rule of law. That is a perennial challenge for China. Usually those highly polluting firms just bribe off the police, pays off local regulators to continue polluting the waterway. How can that be implemented when there is still a lack of institutional rule of law that can ensure enforcement at local levels in China? I think those are the challenges.
Big challenges for China, Afshin. And I guess the biggest challenge is, how does China try to implement this agreement, try to meet the goals of the agreement, and at the same time try and achieve a bigger growth rate?
I mean, this is the ultimate challenge that China faces, but not only China, I think the world faces. I mean, China it certainly needs to maintain its growth at 6.5% and above, but the world needs to maintain growth. I mean, look, at the end of the day, the world is addicted to growth. And the reason the world is addicted to growth is because most countries around the world, particularly many of the G20 countries, are highly leveraged. You know, the debt to GDP ratios are rising, and you can't you meet the job requirements of your population. You can't maintain these record levels of growth that you need unless you use fossil fuels. And we're still living in a fossil fuel world. Fossil fuels are 85% of world energy consumption. By the year 2040, it's going to be about 80% of world energy consumption. Coal, oil, and natural gas are the fuels and the energy that is powering this growth. So that's the fundamental, irresistible force meeting the immovable object in this climate change agreement is how do we, get to the growth that we need to maintain jobs and the economy moving, and how does that, jibe with, the need for fossil fuels? And I think ultimately that question has not been answered.
Simon, there's been criticism of this deal in Paris. Some scientists say it's too vague, too ambiguous. There are, of course, no legal obligations on countries to meet the terms of the agreement. James Hansen, who's a climate scientist, a very well-known one, he said that there have been lots of promises but no action, and the British publication New Scientist says we would be lucky if they restrict temperatures by 2030 to under 3%, and they're talking about 1.5%.
Well, I mean, the reality is it's better to have this deal than not have this deal.
Right.
Advances have clearly been made. We're further down the road of trying to resolve these issues than we were before Paris, for example. In a sense, though, there's something in this for everybody. If you're Barack Obama, you get to say, right, I've ticked the box, environmentalism, that's part of my legacy, I've done what I can. If you're the Republicans, you get the opportunity to use this as a political football going forward in the presidential election, because you can decry President Obama for being too much of an environmentalist. And if you're an environmentalist, and I was talking to one activist here in Washington last night, it's just not enough. And the president should have been bolder and done more to run the risk of crossing that tripwire where this becomes an international treaty and then requires congressional approval. So, it's the best possible outcome that could have been achieved given all of those various competing interests. It takes things a little bit further down the road, but not as far as many people would have liked to see it go.
Afshin, do you get a sense in countries like the United States that there is huge public support for the kind of agreement that we saw in Paris?
I think so, and I think in particular when you poll younger people, there is a global sort of millennial that believes in these kind of ideas. And I think what John Kerry said that was very important is he said that this sends a signal to the private sector to get started on green technology and it's all sorts of sustainable energy initiatives. And when you've polled millennials, you see those young people say, no, these are the kind of companies that we would like to work for. These are the kind of companies that we want to buy products from. So I think it is popular here in the United States.